All right, so welcome to my talk. This is the development diary of Marvel's Spider-Man. Specifically, I'm going to be speaking more about the cinematic creation in Marvel Spider-Man, but I worked a little bit on combat in the beginning of the project, and we'll just get rolling here. So my name is Brian Wyser. I'm a lead animator at Insomniac Games. I've been in this animation racket since the last century. I've been doing this for quite a while. I've worked in VFX, I've worked in games mostly, spent some time in tech, and even had a period where I had my own company. About 5 or 6 years ago, I came to Insomniac to work on Sunset Overdrive. And then shortly after we completed Sunset Overdrive, Sony came to us and said, you know, we'd like to work with you guys on a Marvel property. What do you think? So we were obviously excited. And let me hit one thing here. Sorry about this. There we go. Got to time myself better here. And we got the opportunity to choose which character we were going to use. So me, being the animator or the artist, I really wanted to do some obscure character, but boy, was I wrong. We chose this guy, Spider-Man. So I hope to provide a little bit of insight into our cinematic process at Insomniac Games. I mean, maybe for some of you this will be a review, for some of you this is maybe what you do every day, but hopefully I'll either give you some tips on how you can improve what your storytelling or your projects turn out to be, or I can validate some of the things that you're faced with every day, and you can realize that many of us face these same problems. The other thing I want to say is there are definitely spoilers in this talk. I apologize. There's a few moments that I wanted to highlight. And really, though, our game has been out since September. And if you haven't played it, maybe you can't afford it, go borrow it from a friend. What I will say is swinging through the city is pretty damn fun. And I had nothing to do with that. That was an entirely different team. But get it. Try it. It's awesome. All right. So here we go. Spoilers. Walk out if you need to. All right, so early on in Spider-Man, like I said, I was working on combat. Our animation director, Bobby Coddington, he was serving as the main animator, and then a few of us rolled onto the project in pre-production. We spent a lot of time focusing on comic book imagery as the source material for our posing, and I'll step through a few of them here. And at one point in time, my talk had the exact comic slides that would match up with these images, but I couldn't clear those through legal, so we can't get those. You can't see them. You can just guess. Some of these are pretty clear. Some of these are similar to covers. We also jumped into tests. This is the thing I did on the first day of the project. I was just playing around with our Sunset Overdrive-based Spider-Man. We really didn't have a character yet. And I was trying to figure out ways for us to present an alternate form of combat, something that isn't just punching and kicking. And along the way in combat, there was another test that we threw in, which I think made it into the game, the slide under dodge. This was actually something that was introduced by myself and an engineer during a little bit of downtime right after a milestone. The counter and kick after that, I think, got cut, but at any rate, we got some of it to stay. In addition, as you guys can see, there's a theme here. I was really into getting Spider-Man to climb all over his villains. I didn't want him to just punch and kick. I wanted him to just disable them in other ways that only this villain can to differentiate our project and lean into those differentiators. Again, none of these tests are actually final. This is just something I was throwing together. So to give you a little bit of background, at Insomniac, we have a system that is based on Maya. We export our scenes from Maya, and they get funneled into our cinematic editor. So this is a view of our timeline in the cinematic editor. And to anyone in here that has edited before, it's really incredible for us that we have a tool set that looks like a nonlinear editor. We're able to slide around shots, add tracks, add effects, add lighting, and all the other aspects of our scenes can be easily entered into this editor. This is also accompanied by a viewer, but I didn't want to show you that. It just doesn't run as well, and at any rate, it's not there. The other, I think, advantage that we've added to our pipeline is our camera. We've spent a lot of time working on ways to improve the way we shoot. Most of this work has come from trial and error at Insomniac, but a lot of us have come from other studios where we've experienced creating films or shooting for other cinematics, and there's benefits to what we do. One of the things we're always trying to think about is where is the camera? Who's operating the camera? Who's holding it? Based on the answer to that question, it'll define how the camera functions with a little bit of frequency and a little bit of noise. To aid in the animation work and make our job faster, we don't hand animate all that all the time. We have a number of different sliders here that you can kind of see in this initial column. And really all that these are a way to dial in the weights of a number of different frequency or a number of different wavelengths that apply to the translation channels on the camera. So for instance, shake is something that you'd often use if you were in a helicopter shot where the operator might be sitting there and something that's vibrating. And wave is something we use often when we're trying to do a little bit of handheld. The other advantage that or the other addition that we've added to our camera to help us be more cinematic in our thinking and the way we're trying to tell stories is we've actually mirrored real-world lenses from an Alexa Prime camera package that you would find on a film set. This came from one of our incredibly talented animators, Josh Gridley, who had joined our team after leading a number of productions at Third Floor and working on film previs. So now back to the story. After about a year or so working on combat, our narrative team started to shape the scenes and the overall trajectory of our story in a way that we could start working on it. So I moved from combat over to cinematics, and we started to realize that we were looking at about 90 minutes of story cinematics. And that's just our story cinematic team that I was the lead of. There was a number of other animators involved in 2 other animation pods that worked on in-game set pieces and massive moments and other mission-related cinematics. So on my pod, we had 12 animators. That does include myself and the animation director, who were very involved in the scene creation. We had roughly 2 years at that time to finish our story. And yes, it was freaking daunting. I mean, so many of us were really concerned with the fact that we were jumping into a character that was, arguably overly saturated in the market. Maybe people are bored with him. Were they going to like what we made? So I was pretty freaked out. So just to give you a high-level view of our process when it comes to creating cinematics, we start with previs. Most of our animators will jump into doing thumbnails or animatics on their own, but that's not something that we've actually incorporated into our workflow, because in my experience and in the experience of our team, it's much more efficient for us to jump into 3D as fast as possible. Once we identify our previs, we get to a level of time lock, then we'll identify what we can animate with hand keying, which is a lot of the Spider-Man work or a lot of the villains that are in the scene. Or we'll identify the scenes that we need to take to PCAP. After we get data back from performance capture, we'll lay the scene out again. Part of that is because we don't want to infect our animators with, or excuse me, our actors with our previs. In most cases, we don't even show them our previs. We give them good blocking instruction. We tell them where the cameras will be, but we want them to help bring about the performance. We want them to help us make a better character or a better scene, which requires us to lay out again. After we get through a number of weeks of animating and working on layout and coming to a final edit, animation is finally ready to release that scene to the other departments that will help bring these things to final and actually make them so much better than we can create on our own. So we lock the edit, we release it to visual effects, lighting, and audio, and score, and anyone else who has to contribute to the scene. And finally, concurrently now at that point, we're polishing the scenes, we're fixing bugs, and we're banging away on many other scenes. So, previs. Generally speaking, at Insomniac, we assign 1 scene per animator, and we try and cast these scenes out to animators that have strengths and weaknesses. But we're not limited to that. We don't want to pigeonhole people, so we allow them to try different scenes. We iterate exhaustively on previs, especially on I-20. We would meet twice a week, where we would gather together the entire cinematic team and sit for an hour, hour and a half in a room, and all go over the scenes, provide feedback, a safe place to weigh in on what we were working on. This also helped us because we didn't have a singular person shooting them or editing them, so it helped us to remain connected. And the other benefit of jumping right into previs is we're readily able to add these into the game, like this little joke that our animator threw in there at the end of the scene where we didn't have all the pages. Once previs is built, we can put this in the game, we can identify hookups, or as many of the people in this room might know who work on cinematics, that's the point where the character leaves gameplay and goes into cinematic, and then leaves cinematic and goes back to gameplay. We spend an incredible amount of time just focusing on those little bits. It's actually a disproportionate amount of time. All right, so as I said, the animators on our team are cinematographers as well. So we spend a lot of time working through previs, and when we get back into layout, thinking about how we can use the environment to help tell the story. We're thinking about depth planes. We're thinking about ways to really work in old 2D animation styles. And as you can see here in the bottom 2 images, so we had a shot with Peter, or Spider-Man, suiting up in the very beginning of the game. And in the one on the left, late on in the project, we realized it was a pretty flat shot. There was a lot of information, but it was equidistant from the camera. So we just threw in this bed to give us a little depth of field element in the foreground, and that, I think, plussed the shot. One of the other things we do, in my opinion, is we shoot scenes overall twice. The first pass is to get comprehension. It's to allow us to build something that makes sense. We're not crossing the line of action unintentionally. Scene geography makes sense, you know where actors are. And then we take another pass where we jump back in and try and infuse subtext as best we can. And that could be altering compositions, moving the character to the center of the screen, or offsetting and having them look into the short side of the screen to let the audience feel awkward, or looking for frames within frames or other opportunities And again, this is a massive art form in and of itself. I won't go too deep into it, but it's something that so many people on our team are really working hard to do in addition to being animators. So another thing, we have to shoot a lot of dialogue scenes when it comes to the story cinematic pod. And it's some people's tendency to want to shoot the words that are coming out of a person's mouth. And I want to raise the importance here of reaction shots. Reactions of characters within a scene help the audience understand how they should feel about the scene. They help us understand the emotional journey that a character is going through. I say no dragnet because that's an example that I found in a Walter Murch book where he describes that old show. I don't know if anyone in this room knows that old show. But the way that they would shoot it is they would point the camera at the speaker. And it ultimately felt like a tennis match. You'd see one person speak and they'd cut and put another person and they'd cut and they'd put another person and they'd cut. And you didn't really understand the emotion of the scene. And I suppose it will work for a factual-based story, but not necessarily something we were working on. So this scene, again, big spoiler. You know what? I'll pause this if anyone does not want to watch it and go back. But anyway, go back to that again. Sorry about that. This scene was actually the topic of conversation. We got feedback.
You knew?
That I was told to put the camera on Aunt May when she's talking to Peter.
I never wanted you to worry.
I did. And I am so
right in
proud
here.
of you. And Ben would be too. All the people you've saved.
And that's just one small example where, I mean, it's small, but I think it's important in that scene where we understand Peter's journey. We feel with him. And if the camera was on Aunt May, it wouldn't have had the same impact on the audience. So reaction shots are important. So the other thing that our animators work on is editing. We're animators, cinematographers, and we're also editing scenes. And just to quickly gloss over some of the things that we think about, we certainly want the edit to mirror the emotion of a shot, of a sequence. So in these initial shots, this is a conversation between Peter and MJ, and it's a very low tempo, calm scenario. And we give you long shots. We're not cutting around this very frequently. We're not affecting the audience with how fast we're going from shot to shot. We're trying to allow the rhythm of the shots themselves to support the action. In contrast, what I'm about to show is a fight scene where, as you can see, the shot lengths are distinctly shorter. We're bouncing around very quickly. We're trying to get you to feel the chaos of the action. And in addition, we keep the camera moving and really just kind of keep the pace rolling. And lastly, to talk about editing, there's the power of discontinuity. So sometimes within an action moment, you want to show an action twice, so it heightens the importance. This is seen often in John Woo films, in Jackie Chan films, where in one shot, they will show an impact of a fist hitting the face. And then on a cut, the next shot will show 3 or 4 frames prior to that impact, so you're seeing it twice. Now, the audience doesn't catch that, but it adds importance to that shot. It adds importance to that action, and it helps to sell what's happening in the scene. So in addition to editing, when it comes to timing...
We were close, but...
I'll let this play.
I'll keep trying. I will find a cure. I will. I love you so.
So one of the first things we do when we assign previs is we record temp dialogue. We get our animators in a room and we record the script as best we can. Some of our animators are better actors than others. I am not one of the good actors. This animator, Alex Zimke, is actually fantastic. He's a great animator and he's a great read. He's in so many of our previs moments. But the point that we want to get at is previs for us is so much about selling the writer's ideas and selling our ideas to the broader team, and we can get buy-in to build these moments. To quote Walter Murch, an editor who worked on so many incredible films from Apocalypse Now to a number of other things, sound is a huge influence on people's attention. And with that in mind, we really try to make sure that our previs contains scores, sound effects, VFX, and really anything we can do to help sell our ideas better. So in a mocap-based game, as anyone in this room can attest to, mocap is definitely not everything.
I never stopped.
Even when you have a scene where it's just 2 people sitting at a table talking, well, there might be a moment where they got to kiss. And it's kind of impossible with the HMCs. So Laura Bailey and Yuri Lowenthal, fantastic actors in their own right. But this is a perfect example of where, you know, mocap is not just going to slide in the game. It just doesn't work. Animators are needed. Don't worry, anyone who animates here, your job is safe. So something else that we do a lot on Spider-Man that I think is a huge advantage to the way we're telling our stories. Let's see, here we go. is we tend to shoot some of our action sequences with 2 actors on the stage at the same time, but delivering a singular performance. While this takes a little bit more time in our prep, in our walkthroughs, all right, we'll pause that. What it gives us is a unified performance with voice actor and stunt actor, and we allow the experts to bring to the table what they're good at. Yuri's fantastic, but I'm not going to ask him to do a backflip on the stage. We need him. He's too important. He's going to get hurt. But what this allowed us to do, and many of the people in this room probably understand when it comes to animation and cinematics, you'll often have 80-yard lines or lines that are added after the fact or the script was changed. And as animators, we need to go in there and add head accents and connect those to the body. This is a very quick way for us to capture and get the complete performance all in one. It also helps us to avoid stitching, which is something that you have to do a lot with mocap, where we would have, if I was to take this sequence from our Black Cat DLC, you might have a moment where we're working with the performance actor, and then the stunt actor comes in, and the performance actor comes in, and then we as animators would have to blend those together. That's just a big pain in the ass. It's so much easier to have all this together. So another thing that our previs allows us to do is innovate and solve problems early. So this was a shot that early in our very first cinematic we were putting into our vertical slices. This is actually the first previs I put together. On the page, it said, a lot of crazy action happens, truck takes off, and Peter's got to chase the truck. And we leave Peter on the rooftop sitting in a perch position. So as an animator, I just kind of didn't think that was right. Come on, Spider-Man's never going to wait. He's going to chase after this action. So with this, I pushed for our ability to blend from cinematics to gameplay on the move. Early on, a lot of people balked at this and thought this was a big concern, and maybe we shouldn't try that for our initial vertical slice. Long story short, we now have a system that allows us to blend into many states throughout the game, most specifically falling and in the air, which is actually quite easy for us. There's no contacts, and we do this all the time now. All right, so the project's going well. Everything's fine, and then you open up your shocker scene, and this is what you see. Or you go back to your MJ scene where she's in Grand Central Station, and this is what you see. And we all know gameplay's messy, so when Otto and Norman talk, this might also be something you see. Now, I'm just pointing this out because as we all know, there's a lot of problems when it comes to creating games. There's so many of us involved. Things change every day. No scene stays the same. Trust me, the scene looked better when we shipped it. But to solve this, one of the things, and I'm going to talk about a meeting, I'm sorry everybody, we actually introduced a meeting midway through production where we realized that most of these problems come from communication gaps. So we have an assets meeting now that's every week. And what happens in that meeting is I sit in the front of the room and I go through our previs, I go through anything that's in production, and we talk about it with all the leads of other departments to identify holes or identify areas where either they don't have the bandwidth for this coming down the pipe, so we need to change course, or they can introduce their ideas early on and we can get buy-in and finish our scenes together. So yes, meetings are important. One of the other things we have in Spider-Man is many costumes for Peter when he's as Spider-Man. In general, the narrative team and writing helped us to avoid many of the problems with him where we had to remove his mask, and it wouldn't have been very easy for us to do that with all of the possibilities that he has for his costume. But it wasn't limited to our hero. So we had this moment in the game where Spider was to stow away on MJ. And this spanned a couple of different missions, and it was through a number of different cinematics.
High alert.
And once that Spider got to the feast center, it was supposed to leave MJ, as you can see in this incredibly animated scene by one of our animators, Liam Murphy. And then it's going to go on and bite somebody else. I won't spoil that, even though I spoiled other things here. However, this is what we saw, again, when we went back to the scene later on, because the designer, rightfully so, had put in the proper suit. And the Spider's gone. So the solution to this was simply brute force. Unfortunately, we had to assess the problems. We had to go to each of those scenes and any other mission or anything that's related to those moments and identify where the least work would be needed, and then we'd fix that. Moving forward, our lead animator, Gavin Goulden, essentially mapped out all of the clothing that any of the actors can wear in our game, and we had a kind of a timeline of their life. So this is something that, while it becomes forgotten pretty quickly, you need to remember that continuity is important. All right, so another problem when it comes to creating cinematics is it's rare that you're aligned with the rest of the game. So in this particular moment, we built a scene that was solely based on the concept below. We shot it. We had this great idea that Spider-Man was going to be tethered to the ground. And it was going to be really exciting. And then midway through production, we realized that gameplay might not even be building that. We may not even have a tether. It's not a thing that'll work. Unfortunately, we had to pivot, and we took what was part of our Sable Agents BOLA that worked. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is cinematics themselves are often challenging to keep in alignment with mission development, and you just need to remain aware and communicate with your teams. Scene rot is a term that we've coined for when you leave a scene alone and something's going to happen. And this is no one's fault. There are so many of us making these games, so many things that are going into them, that something is bound to change inadvertently, and it will affect the scenes as we go back and edit them. So you might have a moment where Spider-Man was supposed to be on a building. You can see a little speck there in the middle. Well, there's no building anymore. Or you might have a moment where one of the Sable Agents is also supposed to be on a building. There's no building there. Or, our villain, after a huge climactic moment, was supposed to look unconscious in a helicopter, but there's a chair going through his chest. And finally, I think one of the most egregious of these ones that I'm highlighting, you saw this a little earlier, where Spider-Man swung through an open space in a billboard. Well, one day we opened the scene, and this is what it looked like. To our team's credit, though, the moment these are identified, everyone jumps to, and we fix these very quickly in all departments. There's great support in Insomniac. So we've had a bunch of problems. We've developed a workflow. We were working pretty well. We're starting to rise above and fix those problems. And we get to the point where we need to start releasing these scenes to other departments and finish them and finish the game. And it's at this time in our production that our animators almost become, well, they're also polishing animation and finishing their work. They become shepherds for their own scenes, and they're communicating with others to make sure that the remaining details are completed. This scene in particular epitomizes the collaboration with other departments and other people to create a performance. So we have an entire fight scene that's on a rooftop at the end of our raft mission. And I would say there's not a single animation in this moment that doesn't include the work of a stunt performer or an actor or an animator completely changing the performance. In fact, there's a moment in the beginning of this where Spider-Man leaps off the Scorpion's tail, lands on Scorpion, and then lands on the ground. And I happened to be working with one of our stunt actors just the other day who was involved in this. And he joked to me, he said he was playing through and he was watching the scene and said, well, there I am. Oh, no, that's not me. No, that's not. Oh, there I am again. And just kind of identifying how much we kind of work together to create one performance. Arguably, I think it would be great if we could go back to crediting the way Disney used to, where they'd have actors and animators and anyone else involved in a character credited on the same slide. All right. So one of the other problems that we have in a massively, in an open world game is we will often have scenes where we want a continuous narrative to pursue, to move through a number of different locations that are nowhere near one another on the map. This would have been completely unacceptable to have loading screens between each of these vignettes. So we kind of started building these Frankensets. We worked closely with the art department to identify all of the parts we need, kind of pull them together and make a unique set that we just throw underground for these cinematics. So while ideally it would be in the open world, it was just simply not possible, and through their support, we were able to complete these in a way that didn't really ruin the game. Here's another example of a Frankenset where we go from the Feast Center to MJ speaking at a desk all the way to Norman's apartment. But in the interest of keeping my talk moving along here, maybe I'll get to some questions. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this.
Over all transit points. Throughout the city.
Right. So not only is this Frankenset notion one way we hide loading, but sometimes we can't do that. The thing we want to hide that's getting loaded is far too massive. And specifically in the beginning of our game, Spider-Man shows up at Fisk Tower and is going to help the police go in and take down Fisk. So we wanted to go from open world directly into this entire instance of our lobby and the entire building in Fisk Tower. Did you see the cut? See where it happened? Someone there? Anyway, so our goal is to, again, work directly with all of the other departments involved in creating anything for our game, and we have to collaborate to make this work. This was really a long process. In fact, to the extent that people told me we shouldn't be doing any of this. This is not a good idea. But we work closely with design and lighting and effects to identify the singular frame on which we are going to teleport Peter from being within the open world to going to the instanced interior that he's now going to continue on. The bigger challenge we have here is constraining our cameras and working with environment to provide visual blockers. But again, this is something we hope to do more of in the future. It is our goal that games at Insomniac ultimately eliminate the loading screen, and we'll see if that works. I don't know. It's a big challenge. Facial animation is another challenge that we have. Sorry, that just burst the mic. So when it comes to facial animation, it is critical that lighting is involved as early as possible.
Can change in 6 months.
So when we look at these
Why
scenes,
did you ask me here, Pete?
you can see a dramatic difference between final lighting and even a passive lighting that was pretty close to final. To the extent that as we're reviewing facial animation that comes from Cubic Motion, incredible team, did some incredible work for our project. Can't thank those guys enough.
There's a lot of baggage here.
You can see the distinct difference. I might not have approved something with that near final lighting versus
This
the
is
final
Silver
lighting.
Saplanova, head of Sable International.
So really what this boiled down to at the end, again, working with another department, we got into this cycle where we would get first pass animation.
Mayor has a pet army now?
Next time you get in my way,
Pause this.
I will not be.
We'll get first pass animation in, then we'll get first pass lighting in. And then we'll go back and get more fixed animation. We'll adjust head and neck because in our facts-based facial animation system, there are blend shapes that'll emerge if the head is pushed back too far, things we can't see before the facial animation goes in there. And then lighting will light again and so on and so forth until we kind of arrive at this final that we can approve and feel is successful and ready to ship.
A lot can change in
So
6
head
months.
and neck. One of the other challenges that we have in our game is the living world. We often had scenes that were in the exterior, through which we had to contend with the fact that we have this incredible system of vehicles and bots that is a technical and creative achievement. If anyone notices, that's my head actually getting beaten down there. But at any rate, so within these scenes, it would be impossible for us to shoot this as an entire cinematic, to contain every character that we have here within our scenes and actually work with it. There's no way Maya would actually even function. So we would break these down and try and leverage the in-game systems as much as we can to tell the whole story. And there's a shot that comes up here that can better articulate what I'm trying to say. Let me pause this one. So this is a perfect example. So within this shot, our cinematic is constructed primarily of these three actors. We have Miles Morales, Rio Morales, and J.D. Morales. And then we have some mid-ground characters that are coming from a secondary cinematic that is funneled into that same one. And then we also have other actors that are coming from the living world. So it's in combination with all these other departments that we can create this one scene. Otherwise, there's no way that we could handle it and the scenes would no longer be performant. So one of the other things that we had to contest with is screens within our scenes. So often on the page, it'll just simply say, and Peter walks by a screen and sees X. Those were often their own cinematics. We had to actually build those out as their own thing. And it was a challenge and often forgotten because it was one of the things that would either fall on effects or lighting or no one really claimed them. We have another one here where Norman is supposed to be speaking on a TV the entire time. If ever you see that in a script, go back to your writer and make sure they realize they need to write that whole speech. Whether or not you're looking at Norman, he should be talking the entire time. And in addition, we have other reveals that are on screens. Again, these are their own cinematics that were unaccounted for, kind of came up in production and we had to throw together. So in conclusion, I hope that you enjoyed this, first of all. Secondly, I think at Insomniac, we've leveled up our storytelling techniques and our abilities to give the audience emotional journeys. I think cinematics have their challenges. I think I've highlighted a few of them. I'm sure there are, I mean, I don't have enough time to go through all of the problems and issues that we face. And many of you, I'm sure, can deal with that here too, or can speak to that as well. And lastly, I hope there's at least a little bit that you can take from what I've said here, and maybe it validates what you've already done in your studio, or you can use a little nugget of information to help improve the way you guys tell stories with more confidence in the future. And that's pretty much all I got. I'm open to questions at this point, but thank you all so much for coming to my talk. Thank you. It's great. My kids are going to think I did a great job. All right. So I'll take questions as long as I can, and I know there's another room that we can walk to if there's more questions after this, so feel free. Oh, I can take one question. All right, you, sir.
Hi. So I have two questions and they're somewhat related to each other.
Okay.
Where in the process do you loop in like the downstream teams like lighting and effects and sound into what you're making for a cinematic? And then you mentioned that you like to include VFX and SFX in the previous process. Are those your animators like doing temp versions of those assets, or is that after you've looped in the other teams and they're providing temp versions?
So the question was, where do we include the other departments, and are the animators doing the temp versions? So I'll answer those in the inverse order. So in previs, the animators are putting those in. But we're not trying to drive the other departments' work. We are not the experts. We're just trying to, again, like I said, sell ideas and get people to buy into these scenes. When it comes to when we engage other departments, we try to do so as early as possible. They see scripts, they see what we're working on, but with the introduction of that asset meeting that I mentioned, we actually engage them in early previs now. We show them the things that we're working on. They're not actually actively working on the scenes themselves, but they at least understand the work that's coming to them and have the opportunity to tell us whether or not they can support that or introduce new ideas that'll help us and improve the scenes in general. We are not the experts in those departments at all. Myself, I have a history in animation, and so does my team, and we're branching out into other things as we develop these scenes.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.